In the heart of Israel's history, one man stands out, but not for his virtues. Achan, from the tribe of Judah, is remembered for his disobedience and the devastating consequences his sin brought upon an entire people. Imagine the scene: the Israelites, newly emerged from the desert, ready to conquer the promised land. But a single act of greed turns victory into defeat. As the city of Jericho was falling, a forbidden treasure seduced Achan. What he did not know was that this selfish choice would not only condemn him but also drag his family and nation into ruin. The Bible spares no details about the gravity of his transgression, and every step of his story makes us reflect: what is the price of disobeying God? And when defeat at Ai struck the Israelites, the question echoed: what had gone wrong? The answer, hidden beneath the surface, would reveal betrayal within the people of God. Achan's story is a timeless warning about how individual choices can resonate within a collective. Stay attentive, for this narrative teaches us profound lessons about faithfulness, consequences, and the holiness of God. Achan's identity and context. Achan was an Israelite from the tribe of Judah, a group that always held an important position in Israel's history. He lived during a time of transition, marked by conquests and challenges, when the people of Israel were leaving behind the years of wandering in the desert under Moses' leadership and entering the promised land under Joshua's guidance. This was a phase filled with promises and hopes, but also with obligations and responsibilities. The people were eager to take possession of the land that God had promised them, and the pressure to behave correctly was intense. Achan's life unfolded in this atmosphere of expectation and faith, but also of moral rigor. The Israelites were at a crucial moment, where each individual action could ripple through the entire group. The responsibility was not just personal, but collective. It was a time when Joshua's leadership guided the people, and his courage and faith were essential for the mission's success. Achan, as a member of the tribe of Judah, carried with him the heritage of his ancestors and the expectations of his people. In this phase, military conquests were seen as manifestations of God's will. Every victory over enemies was considered a confirmation of the covenant Israel had with the Lord. Thus, the conquest of Jericho, the first city to be taken, was a moment of great celebration and anticipation. But for Achan, the challenge of following divine orders was more complicated than it seemed. He was in a context where disobedience was not just a matter of personal failure, but something that could affect the entire nation. It was in this environment that Achan chose to act dishonestly. He could feel the pressure and temptation of materialism and greed. Instead of yielding to spiritual leadership and following Joshua's directives, he made a choice that would change the course of his life and his people's fate. Achan's identity was not just that of a man, he represented a part of a whole, a nation searching for identity and purpose in its new land. Achan's story is, therefore, a reminder of the complexity of community life. He was an Israelite, but his individual actions had a collective impact. Each member of the community was responsible not only for themselves but also for their brothers and sisters. The narrative leads us to reflect on how our choices can affect those around us, especially in times of transition and discovery. Disobedience to God. Achan's disobedience is one of the central points of his story and, in a way, the engine that drives the entire narrative. God had made it clear that the spoils of the city of Jericho belonged exclusively to him. The instructions were direct and unmistakable: nothing was to be touched. However, temptation presented itself irresistibly to Achan, who allowed himself to be led by his desires and greed. This choice was not only a breach of trust in God but also a violation of the covenant Israel had established with the Lord. Achan's disobedience is a powerful example of how temptation can distort judgment. He not only ignored a direct command but also convinced himself that he could appropriate what was not his without consequences. This mentality is common in many of us, the idea that we can act selfishly and that this will not affect others. Achan's story makes us question the nature of disobedience and its repercussions. Furthermore, this disobedience did not occur in isolation. It had direct implications for the people of Israel, who were under Joshua's impressive leadership. The lack of respect for divine orders by a single man had the potential to destabilize the entire community. This is an important lesson about collective responsibility and how the actions of one individual can resonate within an entire nation. Achan's disobedience was not just a personal matter, it affected the relationship between the people and God. What makes Achan's disobedience even more tragic is that he was aware of the gravity of his actions. He knew he was violating an explicit commandment from God. The narrative does not present Achan as someone ignorant or naive. He was fully aware that he was acting against divine will. This awareness makes his decision even more impactful and serves as a warning about the dangers of disobedience, even when we know we are wrong. Thus, Achan's story becomes a reflection on the choices we make and the consequences they bring. Disobedience to God is an issue that transcends time and space, and Achan's narrative invites us to examine our own hearts. Are we willing to follow divine instructions, even when temptation is strong and the consequences seem distant? Achan's story teaches us that disobedience is not an isolated act, but a decision that can echo across generations. Achan's sin. Achan's sin is often presented as greed in its purest form. He not only desired something that was not his but went beyond by taking for himself items that were dedicated to the Lord. The Babylonian cloak, the silver, and the gold he hid in his tent were not mere possessions, they represented disobedience to a God who had been clear in his instructions. Achan's decision illustrates an internal struggle that many of us face, the battle between desire and obedience. Achan's greed is emblematic of a moral failure that is not exclusive to him but resonates in many stories throughout the Bible and everyday life. The desire for what is not ours can lead us to act in ways that compromise our integrity and our relationship with God. Achan, in his pursuit of material goods, forgot what was truly important: faithfulness to God and the maintenance of the covenant that the people of Israel had with him. This distraction is something we can all experience at different points in our lives. The scene of Achan's sin is a clear demonstration that individual actions have collective consequences. He was not only acting for himself, his decision affected the entire people of Israel. What seemed like an act of personal disobedience quickly turned into a problem that required the attention of the whole community. This dynamic of sin and its consequences is a recurring theme in biblical narratives, where what is done in private can have public and far-reaching repercussions. The gravity of Achan's sin is also reflected in the consequences that followed. He not only broke an order but also damaged the trust that God had in his people. The covenant was compromised, and God's wrath was about to be revealed. Achan's story reminds us that sin is not an isolated act, it extends beyond us and can affect those around us. It is a lesson that invites us to consider the seriousness of our own actions and how they impact our community and our relationship with God. Thus, Achan's sin becomes a symbol of the temptations we all face. He represents the struggle between what we want and what we know is right. The narrative not only presents us with the story of one man but also challenges us to reflect on our own lives. What are we willing to sacrifice in the name of our desires? And how can we learn from Achan's tragedy to avoid falling into the same trap? Consequences of sin. The consequences of Achan's sin were devastating, not only for him but for the entire nation of Israel. His disobedience did not result in his personal condemnation alone, but in a collective impact that led the people to experience God's wrath. The story clearly demonstrates that the actions of a single individual can have profound and far-reaching repercussions. This dynamic is especially relevant when considering the collective responsibility of a people who seek to live in accordance with divine guidelines. After Achan's transgression, Israel faced an unexpected defeat at Ai, a city that should have been an easy conquest, given the people's confidence in their strength and union with God. This defeat was a shock to everyone, and a sense of insecurity and disorientation spread among the Israelites. They were accustomed to victories and conquests, and this sudden loss raised questions about God's faithfulness and the protection he provided. Achan's disobedience not only affected his life but also the morale and faith of an entire people. The consequences of Achan's sin also led to a moment of reflection and seeking God by Joshua and the elders. They turned to the Lord for answers, and God revealed that the defeat was linked to hidden sin within the camp. This revelation opened the door to an investigation that resulted in the identification of Achan as the responsible one. Defeat at Ai. The story of the defeat at Ai is one of those episodes that leaves everyone astounded. Just imagine, Israel, a people who had just crossed the Jordan and conquered Jericho with divine help, goes to Ai full of confidence. After all, they had just brought down a fortified city with only a shout and trumpet blasts. But instead of victory, they faced a humiliating defeat at the hands of an enemy that, at first glance, seemed much less powerful. How could this have happened? The Israelites' confidence was so high that, when planning the battle against Ai, they thought they didn't even need a large army. The idea was to send only a few men, a small troop, enough to deal with what seemed to be a weak opponent. But, as seen in the story, this underestimation was a fatal mistake. The defeat was quick and devastating, with about 36 men killed. What should have been an easy victory turned into a disaster, and the morale of the people plummeted. Joshua, the leader, was devastated and fell before God, questioning the reason for that defeat. He didn't understand how a chosen and favored people could be defeated like that, and it became clear that something very wrong was happening. What he didn't know at the time was that this defeat was directly linked to Achan's hidden sin, as he had disobeyed God's orders. Israel's excessive confidence was, therefore, one of the major factors contributing to this defeat. Sadness and confusion spread among the people. How could a people who had witnessed so many miracles fail? This defeat at Ai was not merely a matter of military tactics, but a reflection of a deeper spiritual problem. The feeling that something was wrong lingered in the air, and soon the nation would begin to understand that victory did not depend solely on physical strength but on obedience to God. This defeat would become a turning point for Israel. It would be the first of many lessons the people would need to learn about the seriousness of disobedience and how it could affect not only the individual but the entire community. The defeat at Ai made them look inward and question what had gone wrong, opening the way for the pursuit of reconciliation with God. Acknowledgement of sin. After the disastrous defeat at Ai, despair took hold of Joshua and the elders of Israel. They knew they needed answers and went to seek God in prayer. And it was at that moment that God revealed the reason behind the failure: there was a hidden sin among them. Wow! Imagine the tension in the air. The notion that the defeat was linked to an individual act of disobedience shocked everyone. Joshua was perplexed. How could hidden sin have caused such a defeat? It was difficult to understand, but the message was clear: obedience to God was not just a personal matter. The sin of one person could tarnish the purity and victory of an entire people. This brought a new perspective on collective responsibility. It was time to investigate, and the search for the truth began. The investigation was intense. The leaders of Israel began to examine every member of the community, looking for signs of moral or spiritual failure. This phase of the story shows how sin is not just an individual act but something that can affect the entire community. What was sought was purification, a way to restore God's favor upon the people. It was a difficult process, but necessary, so that they could advance and have a promising future. When it finally became clear that Achan was the responsible one, the situation became even more delicate. The acknowledgement of sin was a moment of great tension, not only for Achan but for all the people. The weight of guilt lay on the shoulders of every Israelite, for they knew that, in some way, they were all involved. This revelation brought to light the importance of dealing with sin seriously and not letting it remain hidden, as it can have immense repercussions. Thus, the search for the hidden sin turned into a moment of deep reflection for the entire nation. It was an invitation for everyone to look into their own lives and consider how their actions could affect the collective well-being. And, more importantly, it was a call to responsibility, showing that, in a community, one person's sin can quickly turn into everyone's pain. Confession and judgment. When the investigation finally reached its climax and the lot fell on Achan, the tension turned into heavy silence. He knew there was no escaping the truth, and confession was inevitable. Achan, surrounded by his countrymen and the gravity of the situation, admitted his sin. This was one of the most difficult parts of the narrative, as the confession did not bring relief but an even greater burden. He not only acknowledged his greed but also the disobedience that brought devastating consequences to his people. Achan's confession was more than just a statement, it was a recognition of his actions and how they affected the entire nation. He had taken items that were dedicated to the Lord, and this violation of the covenant was not just a matter of morality but a rupture in the relationship with God. In doing so, Achan affected not only himself but also his family and the entire community. The pain of his confession echoed in every Israelite present, who now understood the gravity of the situation. The judgment of Achan and his family was a dramatic and tragic moment. The decision was not just about punishing a single person but about restoring order and purifying the community. What followed was an execution, a clear example that disobedience would not be tolerated. This action, although severe, was seen as necessary so that the people could reconcile with God and regain his protection and favor. The act of executing Achan and his family was not only an act of justice but also a warning to the rest of the people. The message was clear: disobedience has severe consequences, and God's holiness must be respected. This narrative fits into a broader context, where the well-being of the entire community depends on each one's faithfulness. Achan's judgment left an indelible mark on Israel's memory, a lesson that would echo for generations. As the story unfolded, Achan's tragedy served as a constant reminder of the importance of obedience to God. Sin is not something that can be ignored or hidden, it must be confronted and dealt with. Achan's confession and judgment were necessary steps for the people's recovery, showing that, even in the face of disobedience, there was a possibility of redemption, as long as the truth was acknowledged and faced. Comparison with the fall of man. Achan's story is often compared to the fall of man, and this analogy is not only poetic but profound. Just as Adam and Eve gave in to greed and disobeyed God, Achan did the same, and the effects of his actions reverberated throughout the community. Greed leads to actions that may seem insignificant at first, but that have colossal repercussions. Achan's narrative offers a reflection on how individual sin can impact the collective, drawing a parallel with the story of humanity. The fall of man, as narrated in Genesis, was not only an individual failure but a turning point for all creation. In the same way, Achan's sin brought consequences far beyond his selfish act. The disobedience of a single man caused the entire nation of Israel to face God's wrath, just as the disobedience of Adam and Eve resulted in the fall of all humanity. It is a somber reminder that our choices do not affect only ourselves but also those around us. Moreover, both Achan's story and the fall of man illustrate the fragility of the human condition. The struggle against greed and temptation is a constant in everyone's life. Achan saw the spoils and, in a moment of weakness, succumbed to temptation. This is something we can all understand. The narrative teaches us that we need to be vigilant and aware of our weaknesses, as obedience to God should be a constant priority. This comparison also leads us to reflect on the nature of sin. Both episodes show that sin is more than an act, it is an attitude of the heart. The greed that led Achan to act dishonestly is an echo of the same greed that led to the fall of man. This calls us to self-examination, questioning our own motivations and desires. What are we placing above our obedience to God? Comparison with the fall of man. Achan's sin, much like the original sin of Adam, leads us to a deep reflection on human nature and its propensity to disobey. From the story in Genesis, we see that greed is a powerful force that blinds humans, leading them to disregard the consequences of their actions. Adam and Eve, by succumbing to temptation, not only broke their relationship with God but also affected all of humanity. Similarly, Achan, by disobeying the divine command and taking for himself the spoils of Jericho, compromised not only his own destiny but also that of the entire people of Israel. The narrative shows us that, in both situations, disobedience to God generates a chain of events that results in collective pain and suffering. It's interesting to note how greed manifests in different ways but with equally devastating consequences. Adam desired the knowledge of good and evil, while Achan coveted material objects. Both acts, though different in nature, reveal a lack of trust in God's provision. This comparison emphasizes that the essence of sin goes beyond the action itself. It is a state of heart that seeks satisfaction in something not granted. It's as if, in both cases, humanity tried to fill a spiritual void with things that do not belong to it. This insatiable pursuit led not only to Adam's fall but also to Israel's fall at Ai. Achan's story, therefore, serves as an echo of humanity's primordial failure, a reminder that disobedience to God is not limited to an isolated act but has ramifications that reach the collective. Just as Adam's disobedience brought death and suffering, Achan's sin resulted in defeat and destruction. The impact of sin, both in Eden and in the Israelite camp, is a lesson about the seriousness of the choices we make, showing that each individual decision can reverberate in the lives of many. Moreover, Achan's narrative highlights the fragility of the human condition, which often strays from the right path in search of immediate gratification. God's promise to the people of Israel was of prosperity and victory, but Achan, by ignoring this promise, brought divine wrath upon himself and his compatriots. This relationship between disobedience and its consequences is a recurring theme in Scripture, inviting us to consider how our actions, even those that seem small or isolated, can have significant repercussions on the collective. The comparison between Achan's sin and the fall of man challenges us to look into our own lives. What are the areas where we might be giving in to greed, disobeying God, and compromising our community? The story thus serves as a mirror reflecting not only Achan's sin but also our own weaknesses and the continuous need to seek holiness and obedience to God. Contrast with Rahab. In examining Achan's narrative, it's impossible not to notice the striking contrast with the figure of Rahab. While Achan symbolizes disobedience and its tragic consequences, Rahab represents faith and divine mercy. Rahab, a Canaanite woman, stood out in the biblical story by sheltering the Israelite spies and declaring her belief in the God of Israel. Her courage and faith were rewarded with protection and inclusion among the chosen people. This difference between Achan's and Rahab's fates is significant and leads us to reflect on the nature of grace. Unlike Achan, Rahab did not have the same heritage or context as most Israelites. She was a foreigner in a land about to be conquered. Yet, she recognized God's sovereignty and made a conscious choice to ally herself with the people of Israel. This choice was not motivated by personal interests but by a genuine acknowledgement of God's greatness. The fact that Rahab was saved and even included in the genealogy of Jesus Christ is a powerful testament that God's grace has no limits and can reach even the most unexpected. On the other hand, Achan had everything to lose, yet he still chose to disobey. He knew God's instructions and still gave in to temptation. Achan's narrative highlights how disobedience can arise within a people otherwise committed to obedience to God. While Rahab exemplifies the transformation and salvation that can come from faith, Achan serves as a warning about the dangers of greed and disobedience. This contrast between the characters also leads us to consider the motivations behind our actions. Rahab acted in faith, while Achan was guided by greed. The choices we make reflect our priorities and what we value in our lives. Rahab chose life and obedience, while Achan chose death and disobedience. This moral dilemma is something we all face, and the story invites us to ponder our own decisions and their repercussions in our lives and community. The difference between Achan and Rahab is not just a matter of behavior but a matter of the heart. Rahab, by demonstrating faith in God, became part of the story of redemption, while Achan, by following his greed, became a symbol of warning. This duality teaches us that, regardless of our past or context, the choice to believe and obey God can transform our lives, while disobedience distances us from His grace. God's holiness. Achan's narrative not only reveals human fragility in the face of temptation but also underscores God's holiness and the gravity of violating His commands. The prohibition against taking the spoils of the city of Jericho was not a mere rule but an expression of God's holiness and His intention to preserve His people's purity. The fact that Achan disregarded this command shows us not only his disobedience but also his lack of understanding of who God is. God's holiness implies that He cannot tolerate sin, and violating His word has serious consequences. Additionally, Achan's story makes us reflect on the notion that God's holiness is not only a divine characteristic but also an expectation for those who claim to be His followers. The people of Israel were in the process of becoming a separate people, dedicated to God. When Achan chose to disobey, he not only harmed himself but also compromised the integrity of the entire nation. This highlights that one person's disobedience can impact the community as a whole, a concept that still resonates in our lives today. What makes Achan's disobedience even more serious is that he knew exactly what he was doing. He did not act out of ignorance but by conscious choice. The narrative emphasizes that God's holiness demands not only respect but also an active response of obedience. Achan's violation of God's command was not merely a mistake, it was a deliberate act of rebellion that challenged God's very nature. This transgression had a high price, not only for Achan but also for the entire people of Israel, who faced the consequences of God's wrath. Furthermore, Achan's story also warns us about the temptation to treat God's holiness as something trivial. What might seem like a small act of disobedience can, in fact, have far-reaching ramifications. Sin is not something to be underestimated or ignored, it is a serious violation that requires repentance and a return to God. The narrative challenges us to recognize the seriousness of sin and to revere God's holiness in our own lives. Achan's story is a call to holiness and obedience. It is not merely about following rules but understanding God's nature and living in a way that reflects His character. God's holiness invites us to a life of commitment and devotion, reminding us that our choices have implications beyond ourselves. Achan's story serves as a powerful reminder that, by disobeying God, we not only hurt ourselves but can also harm the entire community around us. And so, we reach the end of the intriguing story of Achan, a tale that invites us to deep reflection on the choices we make and their consequences. Have you ever stopped to think about how a single act of disobedience can impact not only our own lives but also the lives of others around us? By giving in to greed, Achan not only harmed himself but also brought pain and defeat to the entire nation of Israel. Isn't it fascinating how the Bible presents these timeless teachings? Achan's story is a powerful reminder that our actions have repercussions. What lesson can you apply to your own life from this? Are we somehow hiding treasures that do not belong to us? Before we move forward, why not reflect on how we can live in obedience and gratitude, avoiding the pitfalls that sin sets for us? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the content, don't forget to share this video and subscribe to the channel for more biblical stories that challenge us to grow in faith. Until next time.